All right, good afternoon, everybody. So we have Eleanor of Aquitaine today. And of course, a couple of things I forgot from last week. On Cleopatra, I had written out this letter that Antony had sent to Octavian when they were kind of in disputes over Cleopatra. And so here's this letter from Antony to Octavian, who had been complaining about Antony messing around with this foreign queen. What's come over you? Is it because I go to bed with the queen? But she isn't my wife, is she? And it isn't as if this is something new, is it? Haven't I been doing it for 9 years now? And what about you? Is Livia the only woman you go to bed with? I congratulate you if at the time you read this letter, you haven't also had Tertulia or Terentilia or Rufilia or Salvia or the whole lot of them. Does it really matter where you get a stand or who the woman is? So he's basically giving it back to him. So the other thing that I did not mention about Cleopatra was that she purportedly could speak 9 languages fairly fluently. And these are mostly the Eastern languages like Hebrew. Oddly enough, she did not speak Latin, although she may have been trying to learn it once she got with Caesar and Antony. But yeah, extremely intelligent woman. So, Eleanor of Aquitaine. One of the most amazing lives of the Middle Ages, not the least because she lived to be 82, which was an incredible age at that time, and all the things that she had gone through. So on our bibliography, Polly Shore Brooks, Queen Eleanor, nothing particularly stands out about each of these biographies. I think I used the last one, Alison Weir, whom I'm sure sounds familiar to a number of you. She became famous with the Wives of Henry VIII and has written a lot about the Tudor England, but she also wrote Eleanor of Aquitaine. So the first one, I guess, would be the one that's a bit different. This is the short one. As I've often said, I enjoy starting out with something simple and easy and short, and this is actually a book for middle schoolers or high schoolers. She's written a number of works, biographies, for middle school. So, and it's a pretty good read. And as I would always caution when you're reading something that's written for young people, that they tend to stress things that are more exciting rather than stress being accurate. And but all in all, it's still a good read. If I was to pick one for a light summer reading, I would probably pick the second one here, Marion Mead, probably the most enjoyable to read of the bunch. But they're all very good. And of course, I couldn't go without mentioning this. How many have seen this one? Very good. One of the greatest movies ever made. Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn, just a magnificent pair. The dialogue, this is really all about dialogue. There's not a lot of action. It's all set in at a castle, and it's all the wrangling that goes on between the two of them and the 3 sons that they had at the time. Everybody wanting power and everybody wanting to stab the other in the back one way or another. And the King of France, Phillip, was there also. Now, naturally, none of that actually happened. But they talk about things that happened. So in that way, it has some historical value because of that. The one thing that stands out to me most that I would object to in this movie, of course it was a play first, it was a Broadway play, and it was adapted to the screen. The thing that I would object to the most of this movie is that Eleanor herself was just as mean-spirited and cynical as the rest of them. She was not. She was very tough. She could be ruthless when she needed to be. She was not a terribly cynical person, especially when it came to religion, and I'll talk about that later. But she deserved better than this movie. But it is a great movie, though. So, the family background. Her grandparents, Duke William IX and Philip of Aquitaine, and Viscount Amory I de Rochefoucauld, and Dangerosa. How's that for a name, huh? Dangerosa. So, her maternal and paternal grandparents. Her grandfather kidnapped her grandmother. William kidnaps and marries Dangerosa. Now, they both already had children at this point, okay? So, anyway, I threw this in. Here's the Kingdom of France and the duchies that it's separated. I have that on your handout as well. We'll talk about the different territories. So, William IX's son, William X, marries Dangerosa's daughter, Eleanor. And so they had a daughter, Eleanor, which we make into Eleanor. What that means is the other Eleanor. That's Eleanor.
Wow. Say that again.
Okay.
My name just happens to be Eleanor.
Oh, wonderful. So the mother is named Eleanor. The daughter, her daughter, she named the other Eleanor. Eleanor. Eleanor is how that comes down to us. And by the way, that type of thing where a duke or a count goes and kidnaps a woman and the guy's already married and somehow divorces his wife and takes this new woman on to be his new wife, it sounds horribly shocking to us. Like, how could that even happen? It was not as unusual as you might imagine in the Middle Ages. So anyway, Eleanor, her early years, unusual for any young person, but especially for a young woman. She was taught to read. She was not taught to write, but she was taught to read, and she loved literature as she grew up. And so she enjoyed writing, hawking, and of course needlework. That was the pastime of women back in the day. Back in the Middle Ages, every woman was supposed to learn needlework. And the other thing, all of the chroniclers, all the historians agreed that she was a wonderfully beautiful woman. But nobody told us what she looked like other than that. We don't know anything about her looks other than she was beautiful, stunningly beautiful. There are some hints that she had auburn hair, but that's about all we know. And even then, it's kind of sketchy. So we know that she was a very energetic person, intelligent, headstrong, sometimes very impulsive, and it was said she had a great vitality to her. So, William made Eleanor, since he had no other children, or she was the oldest daughter, she became the sole heir, which for her became kind of a dangerous thing. Because as I said, it was not unusual for dukes and lords to go around kidnapping women, especially women of property. And it didn't matter whether she was good looking or not. If she had property, she was valuable. So, in order for her own protection, he sent her to Louis VI. He was also called Louis the Fat. And you can imagine why. It was said that he could no longer mount a horse or a woman in his old age. So that was Louis the Fat was enthralled. This is a great thing that I get to take care of the sole heir of all of these lands. And so he says he's going to marry her to his son, also Louis. So the two of them marry, and very soon after that, Louis the Fat dies. And so she is now Queen Eleanor. And so they unite Aquitaine, Poitou, if I'm getting that right, and France. Now, I'm going to go back to this one really quick. It's kind of an odd setup for the day. You are seeing the Kingdom of France. Now, the King of France, who is the lord of all of this territory, does not directly control it, because he has the lords and dukes of various counties and territories who swear fealty to him. That does not mean that they are loyal to him. The legalities of the day meant that if you were the lord of a particular county, Eleanor of Aquitaine has Aquitaine, and she rules it. But every so often, she's supposed to go, each of the lords and dukes of the different counties go to the king and swear fealty to him, and then go back to their own counties and do what they like, more often than not. So, when the King of France found that he could have his son, his heir, marry someone who was a very powerful, who owned a lot of land, that was a great thing. He could unite this, and the King of France could actually rule a lot more of his own territory, which was considered France. So, they were married July of 1137. Louis is 16, Eleanor is 15 at the time, and they very quickly become king and queen. And this, I have this on your handout also, this is the only artifact that we have of Eleanor's. This was a gift, a wedding gift from her to her husband.
What is it?
It's a vase.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. I should have put that on there. So this is a vase that somehow survived the ravages of the Middle Ages to come down to us. I think it's in the Louvre Museum now, as the only artifact that we have of the time, Eleanor. So, Louis VII, a very religious, pious man. He was not expected to be the king. He had an older brother, and he was happy about that so long as the brother stayed alive. He wanted to be a monk. He loved spending time with monks and reading sacred literature, and he wanted to spend his days pretty much as a monk. And then his brother died, and that ruined all of his plans. So he had to get married, and he had to rule the Kingdom of France. It was said that he was a tall, muscular kind of guy, intelligent, but sometimes overly emotional and kind of childlike in his simplicity and trusting of others. And as I said, Louis VI died not long after their wedding. So here is Louis VII. The pictures, the portraits that I'm going to show you are here mainly for show. Portraiture as an art form did not really exist at the time. So these are just for show, really. We don't know as precisely as we would like what anybody looked like at the time. So, for entertainment, if you are royalty, you get a troubadour. At the time, there's kind of a mini renaissance that historians will tell you is happening. The great barbarian invasions are over with. The Scandinavian Vikings are no longer ravaging the countrysides throughout Europe as they used to. And so things have settled down somewhat, and so people can get back into education. And one of the means of doing this were the troubadours, who were the poets of the day. And Eleanor, being someone who was relatively well educated at the time, loved poetry, and so she would encourage the troubadours to visit and create poetry. There's one in particular who got himself in trouble getting a little too close to Eleanor, writing poetry about her, which it was a fairly common thing if you were just a troubadour and you present your poetry to the king, that you flatter her. That was expected. This guy went a little too far and he was booted out of the castle. So Louis, now that he's king, he kind of misses his the monastery and the monks, and he still continues his religious studies. And as it turns out, he was not a terribly sexually active sort of guy, which left Eleanor kind of lonely. Although she did get pregnant in the first or second year of her reign, but she had a miscarriage. And she actually would complain sometimes to her confessors that I think I'm married to a monk. And one of these guys, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential clerics of the day, of the Middle Ages even, was a powerfully commanding figure at the time. And when he spoke, it was said that kings and princes would tremble in their shoes because just the power of his personality would shake them when he criticized or condemned them for their sins. So Eleanor, being a strong-willed woman, wanted to be involved in the government and in running the territories of France, especially since she knew, she was familiar with her territories, Aquitaine, and she would give advice to Louis, who generally would take it at first, but then it was, I guess, pointed out to him that it's okay for your wife to give some input now and again. It is not okay for her to run the kingdom, and you are letting her push you around too much. And this was St. Bernard of Clairvaux mainly. He was not the only one, however. It was seen as kind of an embarrassment for Louis to be dominated by his wife. And so St. Bernard would talk to her and tell her that she needs to be a submissive wife to her husband. I think at the time she recognized that that was what she was supposed to do, and she tried. Probably not very successfully, but she tried. Then later she did have a daughter, Marie. Here's Bernard of Clairvaux. So I've thrown in this little incident. I could have mentioned many really strange things that happened through the Middle Ages with regard to Eleanor and her relationships, but that would take up too much time, so I'm going to talk about this one. There was an argument over who would fill the place of the Archbishop of Bourges, who had died, and Louis had his own idea of the man he wanted to take that position. Unfortunately for Louis, that was not the man that the Pope and other clerics wanted. And so Louis said, well, that doesn't matter. I'm going to have this guy be the Archbishop. The Pope condemns him for going against his will. And the Pope, here's another thing, in the Middle Ages, what power did the Pope have over the kings and the various princes? What could he do to them? Excommunicate. And what else? There's another thing they could do for the whole territory, the whole country, if they wanted to. An interdict. The Pope, and this happened over and over again, when the Pope was angry with a particular duke or prince or king, he could say, you can be excommunicated and I'll put an interdict on your lands, which means that no priest could perform any religious duties for anyone. Nobody could be buried. Nobody would get communion. And that was a horrible thing for the people to go through, because they would believe if we are under interdict, that means we are all going to hell if we die during this time. And so it's strange to me how often that happened, and the kings or dukes would just sometimes not even care. You'd think they would be more religious or even superstitious about that sort of thing, but it happened time and time again. Another incident, we have Petronella and Raoul. Eleanor's younger sister, Petronella, was going to marry a man who was already married, and so Louis was going to help out. He was fine with it, get the guy divorced and marry Petronella, but the Pope was very much against this, because Raoul turns out to be a pretty awful character, and he was not going to get permission to do this. And so the Pope, because Louis went ahead and had this, had his bishops that he had under his thumb perform the rites, the Pope put the whole of France under an interdict. It didn't last too long. They worked things out as time went by, but it was something that was, as I said, it happened with a frequency that you just would not imagine. So the other big event, as Queen of France, they go on crusade. Louis, being a very, as I say, a very religious, pious sort of guy, also, as King of France, he had to battle his own vassals occasionally who were rebelling against him. And that, again, that kind of thing was almost always happening somewhere in the kingdom. One particular time, he went after, with his soldiers, a particular duke who was rebelling against him. And he slaughtered people almost indiscriminately. And finally, in this one particular town, all the people of the town had gathered into a cathedral. The cathedral burned to the ground. The soldiers lit it up, and well over 100 people died screaming and in agony. And Louis listened to that the whole time and felt like, I'm damned now. I have killed so many innocent people, and I'm going to go to hell for this. So I've got to do something. And what do you do when you've committed some horrible murders and think you're going to hell? You go on crusade and commit some more murders, and you'll go to heaven. But this time when you kill Muslims, it's a good thing. And that's basically how he saw it. So, the Second Crusade, promoted by St. Bernard and the Pope, 1146, Louis really wanted to purge the guilt. He felt horrible at all of the killings that he's done. So he gathers together. Of course, it's a very expensive thing. He has to basically take an awful lot of money from his dukes and lords and the common people to get this crusade going. And so they travel. They travel overland, believing that this would be safer than by sea. And they travel to Constantinople first. Constantinople, the people, Greeks there in Constantinople, always have mixed feelings about this sort of thing. When the Crusaders come through, they come through Constantinople on their way to the Holy Lands. It's a very good thing in Constantinople that they're going to fight the Muslims. It's not a good thing that they come through Constantinople. They're like hordes of locusts who come and tear apart the countryside. And for many of them, they think, that these crusaders are often just as bad to us as the Muslims that they're going to kill. Because, again, they are very primitive sorts of people in the Middle Ages. When you have thousands of young men in the Middle Ages traveling through the countryside, and Louis would tell them, you are not to steal from the people, you're to treat them with courtesy. They didn't listen, and Louis did not control them well. And so you would have rape, rob, and pillage as you go through each town that you pass. However, they were not nearly as bad, apparently, as the Germans, because there was a group of Germans who were coming on the crusade as well, who would just plunder every town that they passed. And it wasn't even safe for the soldiers themselves, because they got this reputation of being so barbaric that any stragglers of soldiers would be immediately captured and murdered. And there'd be bodies of Germans that you'd see on the roadside as they passed. So anyway, they go to Constantinople, and so the soldiers were not allowed in the city. And that was a given. You don't want these barbaric young men in your city to destroy it, and they would have. But Eleanor and Louis got a tour of the city, and they got to see some wonderful things. Constantinople still being a grand city at the time. And they got to see the relics. In the Middle Ages, relics were a wonderful thing that people would oftentimes make up. But churches would pay good money for things that they thought were from Christ's time. And so in Constantinople, they had the lance that pierced Christ's side when he was crucified. They had the crown of thorns that Jesus wore. Who would have known it would live that long? They had a nail from one of his hands. They had a part of the cross, and they had the stone that covered Jesus' tomb. Yeah, how about that? Of course, some people would say there's enough pieces of the cross to build a ship, because so many churches said, hey, look at this piece of wood. It's from Jesus' cross.
What's about the fork?
Huh? Oh, yes. That is a wonder as well. In medieval Europe, they had knives and they had spoons. They did not have forks. In Constantinople, they were shown this new instrument that you could eat with. It's called a fork. it was unknown in Europe at the time. People eat with their hands. Unless it was soup and then you had a spoon for it. Yeah. And there's a whole history behind the fork. Even in America, we didn't have forks, or only the rich had forks up till around 1800. The colonists, it was almost unknown to have a fork. Everybody ate with their hands.
These relics are still popular in some of those churches.
I'm sure. So here is the Second Crusade. And I just have to say, I don't know how you feel about medieval art. I don't particularly like it. I like art that actually shows you something that you can identify. And as I said, there's almost no such thing as a portrait of somebody from this time that was anywhere near accurate to what they really looked like. It wasn't even meant to. So here's the journey to the Holy Land. They took the overland route at this point to Constantinople, and then a very awful journey, by the way, especially around where Turkey, they go to Antioch, and then down to the Holy Land. So when they reached Antioch, which was also a very grand city, it was rumored that Eleanor had an affair with the ruler at Antioch, who had actually, he was a crusader himself some years before. He was from Europe and he came out to rule this city. And this is where very often people will say that Eleanor first started thinking about separating herself from Louis, that she was being neglected, she really didn't care much for him, and he didn't show an awful lot of affection for her, despite the fact that everyone saw him as being a very loving person. And he would often state how madly in love he was with Eleanor. He just didn't show it physically. So, anyway, so during this time at Antioch, there was kind of a dispute. Louis and the ruler of Antioch got in some sort of argument. Louis didn't want to help him out with his problems with the Muslims. He wanted to get on to Jerusalem. So they get to Jerusalem May of 1148, and they didn't accomplish much. He laid siege to Damascus. That was a horrible failure. Lots of people died and they didn't accomplish much of anything. But Louis really wanted to stay through the year so he could spend Easter in Jerusalem. That was a big thing for him. So they stayed, and he had Easter services there in Jerusalem, and they went home from there. And again, perilous journey. You really risk your life traveling back in those days. Eleanor was actually captured by pirates at one point. They were traveling by sea, and they were on separate ships, and her ship was captured. Fortunately, there were other ships nearby that could come and rescue her from their captors. And so they arrived back 1149. And Louis and Eleanor.
They mostly on horses rather than walking.
It was both, but yeah, when you have a horse, you want to use the horse. For the upper classes, I mean, for the king and queen, yes. And so, and I mentioned this before, in the Middle Ages, you don't generally get a divorce because a divorce meant by law at the time you cannot marry again. If you get a divorce, it's usually because one person has cheated, usually the woman, the men can get away with it. The woman would cheat, the man would say, okay, I'm divorcing you, and she might even be executed for it. So generally speaking, they did not get a divorce. You would get an annulment. And in this case, actually she has another daughter before this. But Louis, who's now 30 years old, is thinking, I really need a son. And she's not producing very many children, and she's giving me daughters. I need a son. So he's kind of thinking it over, but it was mainly Eleanor who wanted the separation. She was pretty much fed up with him. She didn't like him much. So under what grounds do you get an annulment? You have to have a reason. And so this was on the grounds of consanguinity. Does anybody know what that means?
Relationship.
Their relationship. They were within the fourth layer of consanguinity. So they're like fourth cousins or something like that, and that was enough. So the Pope granted this annulment, and the other problem, of course, is that when you get an annulment, often it would make the children illegitimate. They would be bastards, because an annulment doesn't say, okay, you're married and now we make, you give you a divorce. An annulment means the marriage was never legal in the first place, which would make your children bastards. So, what do you do about that? Well, you talk to the Pope and you get an exception for that, because under the grounds that it was an innocent mistake to begin with. So the two daughters are still legitimate. They are now legally no longer man and wife. They have an annulment. Now, so that's 1152. And again, Eleanor, and this is a big thing for Louis, who is probably kicking himself afterwards, because Eleanor now has her lands back. She has not given up anything. When she's married, her husband is now the ruler and rules the lands. But he cannot keep the lands if they get an annulment. She is now the ruler of Aquitaine again, and Poitou. And so, again, Eleanor is in danger. Now, fortunately for Eleanor, she already had a plan. She had already met Henry and planned to marry him right away. So, let's get to Henry. Henry Plantagenet. He was the son of Count Geoffrey of Anjou, who had recently conquered Normandy as well. The mother, Matilda, was the daughter of Henry I, and there was a big civil war going on in England between Matilda and Stephen. I guess I shouldn't get into that right now. Anyway, so Henry, the son of Count Geoffrey, was of middle height, very stocky, red-haired, and known for an enormous amount of energy, very intelligent, loved reading, just like Eleanor, but he didn't really care much for his personal outfits, and he didn't really care for the pomp of royalty. But he was a very determined, very commanding figure. And when he had met Eleanor earlier, and she had let him know that she wanted an annulment, she was going to be separate from Louis, they made a plan. And so, and here's representation. Now, there was actually a number of different paintings that I could have shown you that represented Henry. This one is an older one. I kind of liked this one instead, though.
Oh.
Because Henry could be an absolutely furious sort of man. Well, like I said, enormous energy, a very determined person, and always on the go. And I kind of thought, yeah, this I think fits what I imagine Henry would look like.
That's a more modern painting.
Yes, yes. Somebody, I think, had the same idea I had, that these old ones just don't do the trick. And so this one, I think, better fits my idea of a man who could be just manic in his energy and determination. And in case you are wondering what a Plantagenet is, it is a flower that Geoffrey, his father, would wear in his hat. And that became his nickname, and then it became the family name. So as I say, Eleanor was in danger. As soon as she left Paris, she headed for her own lands, and twice she had to escape from being kidnapped by various lords or dukes who wanted to marry her. And if they had caught her, they probably would have gotten away with it. Unless Henry caught them, because he could be a pretty determined foe too. And the other thing that you might notice here, Eleanor at this point is 30. Henry's only 19. So, but oddly enough, Henry's father was also 11 years younger than his mother. Kind of goes in the family. So the two of them get together and they get married. Legally speaking, they were not supposed to. They were both vassals of Louis VII, who is the king. If you are a vassal of your lord, you must get permission to get married. Henry was the type of guy who would flout that sort of thing and get married anyway and work out the details later. And so Louis is very angry. He realizes that he's been duped. He just lost practically half of his territories to a hard-driven, very determined young man. And so he got angry and he's going to do something about it. He immediately invades Normandy, where the two of them went. But as I say, Henry II, who very soon became, was also, in addition to being a very hard-driven man, a very intelligent, tactical commander, one of the best of his day. And he defeated the armies of Louis at the time.
Now, do you mean Normandy, where the Allied invasion was?
Yes, yes.
Normandy.
Same Normandy. Yeah. As I said, his father, Geoffrey of Anjou, had recently defeated and invaded Normandy. It's one duke to another. Now, again, that kind of thing happened, and that was recognized by Louis. Okay, you conquered this territory of my other vassal. You've got it. I will allow that. Not that he could say no. I mean, he could, but if it wasn't something that particularly bothered him, he would just say, okay, it's now yours, by right of conquest. So, let's go on. So now, so Henry, very soon, his father had died not long after they got married, and so he is the lord of his particular territories along with Eleanor's, but not yet king of England. Stephen, who was the king, he had to fight Stephen to make sure that he would be the heir once Stephen died, and he did. He went through a few battles because Stephen was determined that someone else would be his heir. He didn't have his own children, but Stephen was not at first going to allow it, but Henry convinced him otherwise. And so Stephen dies 1154, and now at the age of 21, Henry is King of England and Duke of Aquitaine, Poitou, Anjou, and Normandy. One of the greatest rulers of the day at this point. And as I say, so Henry, now that he has all of these territories, he has to protect them. He has to keep them in line. And so he is on the move almost continually during his reign as king, because there was always somebody who had a problem with him, who didn't like what was going on or just wanted to be independent. And so he was putting down rebellions most of his reign. And here's Henry II and Eleanor. So one of the things I wanted to mention too, when Henry had himself crowned and Eleanor there, that was the start of a lot of traditions for the British monarchy. This was the largest coronation of the day, the biggest that England had ever seen. And he wanted to impress people as to how great a king he was. So that was really the purpose of it. So Eleanor, now as Queen of England, as always, she was a patronizer of the arts and letters, had troubadours come and create poetry for her and Henry. And also, they were both really into history. Now, some of the history of the day, we would think more in terms of being legends, like King Arthur. They were very into the stories of King Arthur and the Round Table and Merlin and all of that, which they considered history. And so they commissioned men to create these histories, but also of Normandy as well. Henry commissioned someone to write a history of the Dukes of Normandy. As I say, this was a time of a kind of a mini Renaissance, and this sort of thing was going on in many kingdoms of the day, where people wanted written histories, people wanted poetry, they wanted literature. They didn't want to worry about being invaded or the troubles of the day all the time. And from the records we know that she bought things for her castles and houses, carpets, glazed windows, tapestries, and whatnot. They did not yet have stained glass windows, but they had glazed windows. I mean, having windows at all of glass was a pretty upper class sort of thing at the time. So, Eleanor had 3 pregnancies with Louis over the 15-year period of time that she was married to him. Then she married Henry. And almost 1 year after the other, they would have children. First was William, died young, 1153. Then Henry, 1155. Matilda, the first daughter of the two of them, 1156. King Richard, later King Richard, 1157. Geoffrey, 1158. Then there was a short pause. Then we have Eleanor, named after her mother. And then Joanna, and finally John, 1166. So yeah, she could produce heirs, but just not very well with Louis. Now it was, I've heard that there may have been a miscarriage between, since we have this gap here, 1161 to 1165, it was said that there is evidence that she had a miscarriage that would account for why are you not pregnant after 3 years. So anyway, yeah, she was a very fertile woman. with the right man. Now, that is not to say that Henry was solely with Eleanor. As many of you know, most kings were not faithful to their wives, and generally speaking, they often were not expected to be. So yeah, Henry was a very voracious man in all of his appetites, and he had women, and often not very discriminate about the women that he chose. He could choose the maids or prostitutes or some woman on the side of the road that he would just find. Quite indiscriminate in his appetite. So, the years of childbearing, and I'm going through this fairly quickly. Part of the problem is that we're really lacking in a lot of knowledge about Eleanor as a person. The chroniclers of the day liked to chronicle kings. They generally did not spend a lot of time talking about women, even if they were the queen. And so we would have liked to know more, but a lot of what we know about things like the things that she bought, we know that because we have what's called the pipe rolls that were records of expenditures of the crown, and so we know that she would buy particular things. So anyway, once Eleanor's childbearing years are done, the two of them separate. Henry is still busy with his battles of the various lords and dukes. Eleanor decides she's going to move back to Poitiers, the capital city of her territories, and she's going to spend her time there. And Henry was fine with that, especially since she was a pretty good administrator, and she could keep her own territories fairly quiet because the people generally loved her and would obey her laws. And as I said, she was a great administrator. She could sometimes change laws that Henry had enacted, and Henry let it be. He trusted her to run her territory. So at 1168, she's 46 years old. She goes back to Poitiers. She dismissed some of the appointments that Henry had made to run the lands. She restored many of the old customs that the people were used to. And she recalls various barons who had been exiled by Henry, and of course continued to support the arts and letters there at Poitiers. And it was said that her court there, for the number of years she was there, was a very grand thing for the Middle Ages. So much so that there were many legends and sometimes stories that even today some historians will pick up on. And this is where we come to the part where if you are a historian who wants to pick out things that make Eleanor even more exciting than she already was, you pick up on the evidence that says she would have what were called the courts of love. And these were generally sort of fun things where she would preside over a court, she and her ladies, and men and women of the court would come for a decision. For instance, you might have two men who are in love with the same woman, and they come before this court of love, and they say, I love her more, and she should choose me as a husband, and the other guy says kind of the same thing, and they talk about their various merits, and this court of love would decide, okay, this is the better guy for her, so that is our decision. That kind of thing, almost like a reality TV show. Those were stories that were made up years later. Most historians will tell you today that was not true at all. But some historians still kind of latch on to that as something that is exciting and fun, so we think it really happened. Yes?
How
How long did that interdict last?
Not long. Probably just a few months. Yeah. There's actually several of them that I wish I could talk about because they're really kind of fascinating. That these dukes and lords would get themselves in trouble and do horrendous things. Kidnapping women, forcing them to marry them. And you think, wow, and they can get away with that. And they did very often. Anyway. Okay. Okay. So here's medieval troubadours. I had to get a painting of the troubadours in there. The great poets of the day. And we come to one of the more exciting parts of her life. Oddly enough, as adventurous a life as she had, some of the most amazing things happened in her old age. And we're not even to her old age yet. But this is one of the big ones. So the sons are growing up. John, as the youngest, hasn't quite reached that point. He's only about 8 years old. But the older boys are at a point where they want control. They want authority. They have been given lands. The oldest, Henry, has been crowned the King of England. But he hasn't been given any authority. The reason that Henry II would crown his son before he even dies is to send a message to all of the barons and the lords, this is my heir. And you are all going to see that he has been crowned so that when I do die, there's no mix-up here. Nobody's going to come up and say, you know what, I think you meant to have this other kid be the heir. Or someone else would claim that the rightful heir should be somebody else. You are all witnesses. All the barons are there. They swear fealty to this young man who is crowned king. He doesn't have any authority. He doesn't have any power, at least not until Henry II dies, which was very frustrating for young Henry. And they would call him the young king. And so he was frustrated, and he talks with his other younger brothers. They have been given lands as well, but are getting very impatient and sometimes don't really like their father because he's a very imperious, strong-willed sort of guy who could really push them around. And Eleanor, as well, is pretty fed up with Henry. So all of them together are plotting. Let's see what we can do. See if we can overthrow Henry II. And just to throw in for good measure, they start colluding with Louis. Or no, I'm sorry. Yeah. Louis, I know there's his son who's coming up later. So Louis is encouraging this whole mess because, hey, why not? Henry's been a thorn in my side for years. They've done battle after battle for many years. And now that his children and his own wife want to rebel against him, wow, what an opportunity. And so he encourages this whole thing, provides, promises soldiers and money. If you go against Henry and you want to fight him, I'm in with you. So the three young men and Eleanor flee to Paris. They've all kind of gotten together and said, now is the time. So the three boys, they make it to Paris. Eleanor does not. She is captured. There's another myth that I want to squash at this point. Eleanor, for all of her amazing abilities as an administrator, she was never one who led men into battle. And I've read in some places where the claim has been made that she had led men into battle, and even a leader on the crusade, which she was not. especially at this point, she was captured. She was never involved in any battles. She was with, a number of times, she was with soldiers who went into battle. She was never the commanding officer. Not to say that she couldn't have. She may have been very good at it, but she never did actually do it. So anyway, the three boys make it to Paris. Louis is thrilled that he's going to fight against his old foe, Henry. But Eleanor has been caught, and she's not going to cause any more problems for Henry. And Henry, with his usual fierce determination, fighting on more than one front, is pretty much going from one front to the next, fighting against Louis and the other barons who thought this would be a good time to rise up against this guy. And he puts them all down. Now, one thing that I've had to leave off, because I'm running out of time already, the whole affair with Thomas Becket. There is another movie that I could recommend to you, Becket, great movie in the day, where the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry, blurted out that he was pretty much fed up with him, and so some of his knights went over and slaughtered him right there in the church. And Henry had to do penance for that. Henry claimed that I really didn't mean for them to go and do that, but I will admit that I expressed some very bad thoughts about him, and so I contributed to his death in that way. And so here's another bizarre incident. Once Becket was slaughtered in the church, his blood was not cold before people of the town flocked there to smear the blood on their own clothes or to gather it up in vials to collect, because they know he's now a saint. This guy was a martyr for the church, and he's going to be a hero to many people. And they were cutting off his clothes as he was laying there as relics to be prayed to and worshipped. Really bizarre. And they were right. Before too long, all of Europe saw Becket as a martyr for the church and someone to pray to as a saint. And all of a sudden, miracles were happening there at Canterbury. So anyway, one of the things that Henry felt he should do periodically, of course, he had himself scourged by the monks not long after it as a demonstration to the Pope that please don't excommunicate me or put my lands under interdict, because I'm very, very sorry, and watch this as these monks beat me with scourges. And he endured that right after the death, and he thought, now that my wife and my kids have been rebelling against me and so many of my lands are in peril, I'm going to go back to Canterbury and get scourged again. And maybe God will forgive my sins even more and help me in my time of need. And so he went back to Canterbury, had the monks whip him again, and this was not a simple operation. This lasted for some time. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 monks participated in this. So he was beaten pretty thoroughly. And sure enough, God forgave him, and his troops started winning the battles on the battlefield. So it worked. Of course, his own efforts helped somewhat too, and he defeated the troops of Louis and the barons who rose up against him and his own sons. And he decided at the end that he was going to increase the allowance for his sons, and that was pretty much all he was willing to give up. He still was not going to give any more authority to the young king Henry or his other sons, and they were going to have to deal with it. And what do you do with your wife once she has risen up and rebelled against you? She's now 52, and he decides he needs to keep her under wraps. And so he confines her in various castles or manors. It was not like a dungeon. It was more like house arrest. So here's the various places that she was kept: Winchester, Sarum, Luddershall Castle, Berkshire, and Nottinghamshire. Apparently, Winchester she was kept the longest, and it was not the lap of luxury, but it wasn't a dungeon either. One might say it was kind of a relative luxury for a queen. At first, she was allowed one servant. The main thing was that she was cut off from communication with others so that she couldn't plot against Henry again.
How did she get out of that kidnapping? Who kidnapped her?
It was Henry's troops who captured her.
Okay.
Or not Henry's troops per se, but troops who were loyal to Henry had stopped. She actually had dressed up as a man with a few other soldiers to get to Paris, and they captured this group and realized that this was the opposing side, and then realized this is a woman, this isn't a man. And of course, the worst thing about this for Eleanor was that she was riding a horse with her legs on both sides. She was not riding like a lady with her legs to the side. And they were scandalized by that. That was a terrible thing for a woman to do. And here, Winchester Castle, I'm sure it wasn't like this when Eleanor was kept here, but I wanted to get in another picture and show you Winchester. But so she was kept here for a number of years, and periodically she was moved. Now she wasn't kept entirely. She was let out on particular occasions, as in The Lion in Winter, that play that was a movie. It talked about that, how she was being kept at a particular castle, but she's let out for special occasions. And that Christmas, oftentimes she would be let out to have family gatherings. So there is still the family fights. Now we have King Philip. Louis has passed on. He got his son. He had remarried, actually remarried a couple of times when his second wife had died. But he got what he wanted. He finally got a son in Philip. And so one of his daughters, one of Louis's daughters, had been betrothed to Richard. And by the way, Henry, the young king, had died of dysentery or something at the age of 26 or 27. So now it's Richard who's the eldest. And so they were being, in order to unite the two kingdoms, Alice, who was Louis VII's daughter, was to marry Richard. And that would bring peace to the kingdom. And she was 7 years old at the time, but she brought with her a dowry of various lands. And so that was a good thing for Henry. Henry was always looking to conquer or acquire new lands. And so he made the deal, and they were to raise Alice until she became an appropriate age and then marry Richard. Henry was never one to stick to any bargain that he decided no longer fit his needs. And as Alice grew up, she grew into a very beautiful young girl, the age of 14 or 15, and Henry decided that he kind of liked her himself. Now that his wife was being confined, he has this young girl that he was supposed to wed to his son Richard, but she's very pretty, and he's going to take her for himself. She had two kids with Henry, and yet all the time Henry was still promising to marry Alice to Richard. Anytime Philip or Louis was asking, or Philip as he grew up, the deal was still Alice will marry my son Richard. But then he decides that John is going to be his heir. So instead of marrying Richard, she's now going to marry John. Now, as Henry is developing his ideas of what his kingdom should look like, it's like every single time that Philip or Louis would ask, he would say, "I'm sticking with the bargain. I'm sticking with the bargain." And they would eventually, Philip would just say, "Look, send her back or marry her now. And I want those lands back." The Vexin was the particular territory that they wanted back. But of course,
I suppose he communicated all of this with his sons by saying, "You're fired."
yeah. But oddly enough, he generally kind of loved his own sons in his own way. In his own way. Odd way that it was, he generally liked his sons. But the feelings change. And so as the years went by, he started to favor John. John was the only son who did not rebel against him. John was only 8 years old. He couldn't have. And John was the closest one to him. And so he was thinking he was going to make John his heir, and kept promising now that John will be marrying Alice. And you'll see in the movie Lion in Winter, that's what they keep going round and round about. So again, the boys are getting together and they're going to fight this. Richard and Philip, he gets together with King Philip, and they're going to fight John and Henry. It doesn't amount to much, but they sign a treaty, and eventually they decide, okay, it's going to be Richard who's going to be the heir. And that is right before Henry dies.
What happened to Geoffrey?
Geoffrey had died some years earlier, and had some disease or other, which often happens. So Henry,
Married Alice.
huh?
So which one of them married Alice?
None of them. Eventually Alice was given back. But this was some years later. They were still, this went on and on for years.
What happened to those two children?
Which, they actually died young. They did not grow up. So, Richard, now that Henry has died, and Henry died a very bitter man, knowing that his own sons, and even John, had conspired against him in this last battles with Louis. He found out that John had actually joined with Richard against him. And he died a very angry, bitter man that his own sons would do that to him. But anyway, so now Richard goes to his coronation. Again, very lavish, large celebration. He is crowned. For some odd reason, women were not allowed at the coronation. Eleanor was the only woman that was allowed. And then the banquet afterwards, no women, including Eleanor, was allowed at the banquet. But that seemed to be the thing. And as, oh geez, I'm going way over again.
We're okay with that.
All right, thank you. So Richard, just like Henry before, allowed Eleanor to kind of run England when Richard was away. And Richard, very much like Henry, was often on the road, putting down rebellions in various parts of his realm. Eleanor became the regent, and was a very good one. As I said before, she was a very good administrator. She relaxed some of the very harsh forest laws. You're not going to get killed by hunting deer in the king's forest. She released several political prisoners people who just criticized the king. And one of the things that, one of the reasons she had to be in charge was that Richard, the Lionheart, goes on crusade with Phillip, of all people, still demanding that Alice marry Richard. Richard has decided that he does not want to marry Alice, and he has someone else in mind. He didn't want to say so, but eventually the two of them had traveled to Sicily on their way to the Holy Lands. And they're traveling together, and Philip keeps pushing him. You need to marry my sister Alice, or send her back to me and I want the lands back. And finally, Richard had to let him know a very good reason why he was not going to marry Alice. She had borne my father 2 children. So, no, I'm not going to marry Alice. And so he finally understood. And so that was done. But he said, I need Alice back then, and I want the lands back. And Richard said, yeah, once we get back from the crusade, then we could arrange that. And then the girl that he had found instead, Berengaria of Navarre, Eleanor escorted her to Sicily so the two of them could get married, because Richard did not want to wait.
Did he even know her?
Yeah, briefly, as well as most couples knew each other ahead of time. But she was a woman of property, and that was good. And she was pretty. Yeah. So Eleanor, once she went to Sicily to drop off Berengaria, was in communication, and she found that John was wanting to usurp power in England and take control, along with one of the barons, or the chancellor, a guy by the name of Longchamps. And the two of them were kind of fighting over who was going to control England. There was a regency council that was supposed to be in charge, but these two men started fighting over who was going to rule. So there's Richard on crusade. He was, as I said before, he was one of the leading soldiers of the day. He was a great military leader, a great tactician, and he won a few battles. When he first got there, he finished the siege of Acre, a very important city on the coast. The city had been under siege for a couple of years, and once he arrived, he made sure that they took that city right away, and they did. And there was
the
a couple.
Crusade, or is this the third?
Yeah, I believe the third. Yeah. But we have problems in England. One of the odd things that John decides to do, he's going to marry his cousin, which was strictly forbidden, but he wanted her because he could become the Earl of Gloucester in doing so. The Pope finds out about it, he lays an interdict, and John doesn't care. Of all of the sons, of all of the people that we've been talking about, John is the most irreverent and irreligious of them all. He openly did not care for the beliefs in Christianity. And why he could get away with that, he was royalty. But he openly flouted the rules of the Christian church and let everybody know. So on the way back, let's see. Oh, so Philip all this time is thinking, hey, this is great, more problems in England that I can stick my fingers into and cause more disruptions. He's trying to help John take control of England, and tells him, well, you should really marry Alice, who you were supposed to marry. And John, even though he just married his cousin that he wasn't supposed to marry, was thinking about it. and thinking, you know, if I join up with Philip, I can really take charge and become the King of England, which I really want to do. And he was about to leave England to join up with Philip when Eleanor got back, and she talked him out of it. In one way or another, she berated him and told him that is not the right thing to do. Your brother Richard is the king, and you are not going to do this. And she persuaded him some way to stop this ridiculous plan. And she interceded with the Pope, sending him letters saying, please help us out. And, you know, if you could lift this interdict, that would be a great thing too. And so the Pope lifted the interdict because of Eleanor. Richard, after the many battles that he was involved in, on his way home, he was captured in Germany, or in Austria, I should say. He was shipwrecked. It was a rough trip home. He was shipwrecked, and on his overland trip back to England, he was captured. And he was captured by Leopold of Austria, who then gave him up to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Both of them were seeing dollar signs when they saw Richard, because they knew they could ransom him for, as they say, a king's ransom, which is a lot of money. So they demanded initially it was going to be 100,000 silver marks plus some other aid, military aid, in the battles that the Holy Roman Emperor was engaged in. And then they decided, Henry talked him out of that and said, okay, it'll be 150,000 silver marks, which is about twice the annual revenue of all of England. And you don't have to help me in my military campaigns. So during this time that Richard is being kept, and he was fairly well kept, it's not, again, he's not in a dungeon. He is royalty. They treated him usually pretty well. So they have to raise the money. Eleanor writes letters to the Pope pleading for the Pope to do something. The Pope is not going to do anything because Leopold already has his troops on the borders and attacking papal lands as they were at the time. So there's not a lot the Pope could have done. So they were raising the money. Eleanor announced to the lands that she possessed, everybody is going to give up, all freemen are going to give up something like 25% of their wealth. Everybody, in order to get this money raised and bring Richard back. John, trying to be the helpful man that he was, tried to raise money too, and he did, and kept it all. He was colluding with Phillip at this time, and they were going to raise money to have Leopold keep Richard. And they sent messages to Leopold telling him that. We will raise this same amount if you will keep him. That way John could be the king. Leopold probably thought about it and realized that one pain in the neck isn't any better than another. To have John and Philip so powerful is not going to help him any more than having Henry back there. So he said, no, I'm not going to go for the deal. So Eleanor, eventually, it took about a year or so, eventually they came up with the ransom, or at least the down payment. They came up with the first 100,000 marks. It weighed an amazing 35 tons. And she traveled with this group, under arms, of course, to Leopold to get her son, Richard, released. And they got him released. So Richard comes back to England, and he is crowned once again. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he was still the king. And that's what you do. You go through these ceremonies and make sure that all the barons are there, swear fealty to him, and see that he, yes, I am back and I am king.
Of course, not the woman that took the money to get him
Right. Yeah. Terribly unfair. That's medieval for you. So John at this point is very embarrassed and very guilty, and John comes to Eleanor and says, "Please plead with Richard to forgive me." And she does. She goes to Richard and says, "This is John. He's pleading for forgiveness. He's your younger brother." Richard very easily forgave him because he had no respect for him as a person. You're just a little boy, okay? You're 26 years old. It was your counselors. You're not much of a man at this point. So yeah, sure, everything's fine. And so yes, I forgive you. And at this point, Eleanor thinks her working days are done. She goes to live in an abbey in her lands, Fontevraud, if I'm pronouncing that right. And this is what the abbey looks like today. It probably didn't look like that back in her day, but she had supported this abbey for years. It was something that she treasured. The nuns who lived there, she was very friends with the nuns and the abbess who ran the place. She supported it and they supported her. And she wanted to retire there. And then other things cropped up. Richard, in one small engagement where he went to a castle, he had heard that the castle, the people of the city had found some sort of treasure. As it turns out, it was a pot of old Roman coins that some farmer had dug up. Probably not worth a lot, but in the telling, the story got to be some huge golden statue that somebody had found, and Richard heard about it, so he's coming to take this treasure. So he besieges this castle, and on one of the days that the castle was surrounded, Richard is walking around inspecting everything, and some ordinary schmuck up at the top of the castle shoots an arrow and hits him in the arm. Richard goes and he has somebody pull the arrow out, probably butchered his arm pretty badly to do it, and it wasn't going to be a big deal until it got gangrene. At that point, Richard could see that his days were numbered. And Richard orders, "Take this castle now." They eventually got the castle. Everybody was hung, except for the guy that shot the arrow. And Richard said, "Bring him to me. I want to talk to him." And so he said, "Why? Why did you shoot me?" And the guy said, "Because you personally killed my brothers and my father with your own hands. And so I wanted to get my revenge on you." And Richard was very impressed with this young man and said, "I understand. I forgive you. I'm going to give you 100 shillings and I'm going to order my men to let you go." And then Richard died. They got the guy back. They skinned him alive because of what he did. So Richard is gone. Richard's dead. And John must fight Phillip to secure his crown. There is another pretender to the crown, a young man, 12 years old, by the name of Arthur. Remember, Geoffrey, one of the brothers who had died some years before, had a son, Arthur. And so Philip says, "You know what, I think Arthur should be the next king." So he's supporting Arthur. There's a battle. They lose. So John's still the king. And Eleanor supports him during these battles. Eleanor, as I say, she can be very tough at times, and so she orders the lands of Anjou, which Geoffrey and now Arthur is the ruler of, and she orders her soldiers to lay waste to the countryside. Philip grabs Arthur and takes him back to Paris to raise him himself. And so Eleanor at this point decides she's going to make known her presence, and she has a progress. And I've talked about this before. if you are the king in medieval Europe, or queen, if you are the ruler, you make a progress so that people can see you every so often to make sure that they see that you are in charge and that you are powerful. So John is crowned king. There's John. But Eleanor is not done. She's 77 years old, and there's one last mission for her to perform. Phillip has a son, and he wants his son to marry one of the last daughters of Castile. And so Eleanor is going to go to Castile to take one of these daughters and bring her back to Philip. So on this journey, she's going down to the Pyrenees, and she is captured. She's kidnapped by Hugh de Lusignan, and this man demands that he should be the ruler of La Marche. And so she couldn't do anything but grant him his wish. She got her revenge later on, but at the time, she had to give him this county. And then he released her. So she goes to Castile, where her daughter, one of her daughters, was the queen. And it was one of her daughters that was going to be chosen as the next queen of France. So,
Wait a minute. So which daughter? Her daughter from her first husband, Marie, or?
no. It was
Henry.
from Henry, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. Oh, it's Eleanor.
Yeah.
Get confused. Eleanor,
Oh, it was Eleanor. Okay.
that daughter.
That daughter.
Yes.
Okay.
So she was the wife of King Alfonso of Castile. Now there was two daughters that she could choose from. It didn't matter which to Philip, but it was to be her own judgment which daughter she was going to choose. She's supposed to choose the elder, because that was kind of tradition. And by the way, these last two daughters were the last of 12 that Eleanor had that were still at home. So she chooses the younger of the two, Blanche, who's 16 years old, and because Blanche shows real promise, intelligence, and vitality. And Blanche, as it turns out, was a very good choice, because she had 12 children also, one of which became Louis IX, we know now is St. Louis. And she returned finally to Fontevraud Abbey to live out her last couple of years. And at the age of 80, she decides she wants to be a nun. A woman who had 10 kids now becomes a nun, and they were not going to say no to her. They loved her dearly because she was a great patron of theirs. And she died 1204 at the age of 82. And she was interred there, and her bones were there for many years until the French Revolution, when they decided that this sort of thing, that royalty should not be worshipped or in any way respected. They opened the vaults, took out all of the bones of the royalty that were there, and tossed them in the river. But we still have the encasements of where the bodies used to be. So there's Eleanor and Henry at Fontevraud.
Did he get there? Did he get there?
He was there too, yes, Henry.
Do you think all of this Fontevraud would have been avoided if they just had Fox News to watch? They had too much time on them.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, there was an awful lot of fake news going on. So I don't know. Any questions? Yes?
Speaking of fake news, was there anything to the story about Richard being discovered when he was captured by the Troubadour Blondel?
You mean, was Richard gay?
No, what
Oh,
was he
because
was-
that was another rumor. I guess there's
The
another.
rumor was that he was identified by his troubadour, who was looking for him when he was captured in
Oh
France.
yeah, I did hear about that. That was something that historians will tell you might have happened.
Might have.
We're referring to when Henry was being held by the Holy Roman Emperor, and apparently there was a troubadour who went around and wanted to find him. He was the first guy from England, and he wanted to find his lord, King Henry, and he would sing songs, and he wanted Henry to respond back. And so that's kind of a legendary story that may have been true. May have. But the other one, I'll save for next week. I'm sorry I've gone way over, but thank you.